Bien, mesdames et messieurs, merci de nous avoir rejoints pour cette session où pendant 30 minutes, on vous propose de plonger dans l'univers de Scattered Spider avec notre invité Preston Miller, directeur de l'unité 42 de Palo Alto Networks. Alors, pour vous donner quelques informations avant que Preston nous rejoigne, Scattered Spider, peut-être que vous le savez, les acteurs de la menace à l'origine des récentes attaques très médiatisées, dont celle de MGM, est évidemment un groupe redoutable que vous allez pouvoir découvrir et comprendre comment est-ce qu'il fonctionne, qui devrait être, si parmi vous il y a des RSSI, dans votre collimateur. Les suivre de près, je ne doute pas que vous le fassiez d'ores et déjà. Historiquement, ils se sont concentrés sur l'exfiltration de données, sans chiffrer les systèmes, mais ils se sont récemment affiliés au groupe ALPHV de Black Cat, que vous connaissez évidemment, ce qui leur permet aujourd'hui d'utiliser des logiciels malveillants de chiffrement et le réseau de négociation rançon, évidemment, de Black Cat. Le niveau de sophistication et de persistance dont fait preuve ce groupe après avoir infiltré un réseau est incomparable à celui d'une attaque APT, bien qu'il ne soit pas considéré comme parrainé par un État. Étonnamment, les méthodes qu'il utilise pour exploiter l'accès au réseau sont relativement simples et tout à fait évitables. Alors, ce que vous propose Preston Miller, c'est de rejoindre pendant ces 30 minutes l'unité 42 qu'il dirige au sein de Palo Alto Networks pour vous guider à travers les tactiques de ce groupe, pour en explorer les techniques, les procédures employées par Scattered Spider. Il vous donnera également un aperçu des cibles, de la manière dont ils peuvent accéder au réseau et les actions qu'ils peuvent mettre une fois à l'intérieur de ce dernier. Preston vous fournira également certains conseils sur les meilleures pratiques à adopter en matière de prévention. Je vous demande d'applaudir, s'il vous plaît, mesdames et messieurs, Preston Miller.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Preston Miller. I'm a consulting director at Unit 42, part of Palo Alto Networks, and I'm here today to talk to you about Scattered Spider and a specific subset within Scattered Spider referred to as Muddled Libra. And so why do we want to talk about Scattered Spider and in general threat groups? Well, it's critical that we in the cybersecurity industry, whether that mean as defenders or whether that's as a consultant or serving as an organization or developing products, it's critical that we maintain vigilance and intelligence on the latest threats, because cybersecurity, just like technology that it's directly linked to, constantly changes. So it's imperative that we as a group and a collective continue to maintain vigilance on the latest threats and trends. Before we talk about Scattered Spider, let me briefly introduce myself. As I said, my name is Preston Miller. I'm a consulting director at Unit 42, specifically in our digital forensics and incident response practice. Unit 42 is Palo Alto Networks' threat intelligence research and consulting arm that serves clients across the globe, both before and during cybersecurity incidents. We also take the intelligence that we learn from real-world scenarios and bake that into our products to help take that mindset of sharing information and taking a collective team approach to ensure that organizations remain secure in an ever-changing world. With that, let's dive into the detail. So who are they? So Scattered Spider initially came onto the scene in the fall of 2022 with a big splash. This was the group behind the commissioning of the Octopus smishing kit that no doubt many in the audience are aware of. This kit facilitated the creation of lookalike Okta authentication pages targeting over 130 organizations in the fall of 2022. Tremendously successful. They were able to harvest credentials from many, many different organizations. However, we're only aware of them having utilized just a few credentials that they had extracted across the board. But nevertheless, this garnered a lot of attention from the media and also the cybersecurity research arms within our sphere. One other thing that became relevant, and this is a common trend that we see time and time again, is this group had their Octopus smishing kit uploaded to VirusTotal, and unfortunately, that since has spawned a lot of copycat attacks. And again, this theme that we're going to talk about throughout the presentation about evolution, how changes within the cybersecurity realm influences other bad actors down the line. You're going to see this and continue to see this across the board. And so I want to talk about a little distinction between Scattered Spider and what Unit 42 refers to as Muddled Libra. And so Scattered Spider is a collective of tactics that threat actors use to perpetrate crimes. Muddled Libra is a subset that within the Scattered Spider network that exhibits many of the same characteristics, but also has some unique motives as well. So digging into the characteristics briefly, Scattered Spider, just at a very high level, this is a group that primarily organizes their crime through social chat applications like Discord or Telegram. They have a very open and flexible network of team members that are associated with many different groups, from the COM or Lapsus and other notable threat groups that flow in and out of Scattered Spider. They primarily speak in English. They appear to be native English speakers. And for the most part, although not exclusively, their demographic is mostly North American. And as I said before on the prior slide, this is a relatively newer group just coming into prominence in the last year. But Muddled Libra in particular is a distinct tangent or subset within Scattered Spider that appear to be financially motivated, initially through cryptocurrency, but now going the typical ransomware route through extortion in particular. But they also exhibited other characteristics, setting them apart from Scattered Spider, making them tremendously difficult to defend against once they're in your network, and we'll talk about why as we go through the tactics in a moment. But when we talk about Muddled Libra, they themselves, because perhaps it's a newer group, are evolving over time. And so on the left-hand slide, we have as the tradecraft that this group exhibited broken down into access, execution, and objective, what they did previously in 2022 and what they're currently doing, because they've changed their approach quite a bit. So at the very beginning, they were using the Octopus Smishing Kit that we discussed before to create lookalike authentication portals and gain initial access through smishing attacks on victims. Once they had that access, they would use commercial VPNs to remote into the corporate environment or to go to cloud, whatever the case may have been. And primarily, they were targeting business process outsourcers. So these are entities that, once compromised, can be a pivot and springboard into other client environments. From that point to now, they now are using social engineering, not so much from a smishing perspective, but socially engineering help desk. They've found this to be much easier, stealthier, and very, very effective. They understand how the help desk process works, how they have metrics, how they need to accomplish a certain amount of calls in a given period of time, and they'll continue to prolong conversations with help desk in order to skip identity verification to get to the point where help desk themselves will voluntarily reset an account's password and or MFA. And at that point, they're in and they hit the ground running. But they also stopped using commercial VPNs exclusively. Now we're also seeing them using residential proxies. And the complication or the challenge with that is that that will then mimic what typically a defender would see from the particular user that's being targeted when reviewing their logs. What I mean by that, for instance, is if someone were to log in typically from a state in the US, like Illinois, for example, and then all of a sudden you see a login from a different country, well, that's going to raise a lot of alerts. A lot of companies have built up defense and technology around such detection. But by using residential proxies and knowing who their target is, because they do a lot of research naturally before they attack, they'll use a residential proxy, for example, around the Illinois area or thereabouts to ideally avoid that detection. So it makes them harder to detect in that initial pass. They've also expanded their targets, so they no longer are pursuing business process outsourcers, BPOs, or telecos, which were two primary targets of theirs early on. They've now moved into targeting singular large organizations that are very sensitive to downtime. So MGM is a great example of that. That's an organization that they recently targeted that I'm sure many of you saw on the news. But by targeting such an organization, there is a lot of impetus and pressure put on that company to continue to be up, to continue to be operational, to continue to serve its customers, and so they're much more willing to pay an exorbitant demand than perhaps others. Now, when we talk about execution, how they're going about doing this, it's very different. Initially, the group primarily didn't leverage malware or leverage very little malware. They were incredibly silent, and they would get into the network using living off the land, not creating detections, exfiltrating data over time, and specifically looking for opportunities to then attack downstream through a supply chain attack. Now it's the complete opposite. I've worked many recent engagements with this group. They are incredibly aggressive and brazen. They will jump into your IR process, for instance, and will pose as people at the company. They'll try to join the meetings between the consultants, the incident responders, the lawyers, and the business professionals. So you have to have everyone get on camera and make sure you validate visually that everyone is who they pretend to be, because this group nowadays doesn't care if you're aware of what they're doing. They will leverage your security tools against you. They will isolate machines that are critical, like domain controllers. They will exfiltrate data using your security tools. Even after you've kicked them out of their network, your network, I should say, they'll leverage security tools, which are often SaaS applications, as a way to get live terminal onto systems they no longer have access to in a traditional way, and download additional data. And when they do that, typically what we see them doing is downloading credential files or downloading documents related to the incident response and recovery and remediation plan, making this group incredibly pernicious and difficult to deal with. And objective. So we talked about this a little bit. Their objective initially was primarily one around effectuating supply chain attacks and getting in the middle of cryptocurrency. And so they would typically target organizations that had large cryptocurrency accounts or were in the cryptocurrency or exchange process and could potentially lead them down that road to accruing cryptocurrency. Nowadays, they've moved on past that and are following the more traditional ransomware route, where they get into an environment, they look to exfiltrate data, and they look to encrypt. And while that sounds simple, it's not as simple as that. They do a lot more than just the traditional ransomware route, but by and large, that's what they're doing at the moment. We'll talk about specific tactics in a moment. So who do they target? We talked about previously that initially they were targeting BPOs and telcos. That was, again, an aim of effectuating downstream supply chain attacks. The telcos were used to acquire telephone numbers that they could then use in SIM swapping. BPOs primarily because of the access that BPOs have in other client environments. The BPOs typically were intermediary victims for Muddled Libra to then impact subsequent victims downstream. And really, you get access to one BPO and you really have access to 5, 10, however many opportunities to cause more havoc. But more recently, as I had indicated, they've moved past that and they're no longer targeting BPOs as their opportunities seem to have shifted. They are now targeting singularly large entities in the financial, entertainment, hospitality businesses, like MGM being a good example of that have low or no appetite for downtime due to the function of the business, and will be willing, without many questions, to pay exorbitant sums to keep the business running. So let's talk about how the attack works. And this is split up into what they previously did in 2022 and what they're doing now, because it has changed. So we talked about smishing, how that was the initial access point in. They would then use commercial VPN to gain access into the environment. At that point, they would primarily use remote monitoring and management tools, RMM. So you're talking about your TeamViewer, you're talking about Atera, you're talking about Splashtop, AnyDesk, all these different applications that are legitimate and have legitimate purposes, perhaps are even used legitimately in your environment, but they would install many of these different applications on multiple machines as they were navigating throughout the environment. So if they lost access somewhere along the way, they had their own backdoors that were obscured or hiding in plain sight as legitimate programs, so to speak. One thing that's notable about them is that they are very particular about discovery. So all throughout the entire engagement lifecycle, they are constantly looking to understand you and your environment. And what that means is they're not satisfied with just gaining dominance of Active Directory. They want to gain administrative access to every single application in your environment and those in the cloud. So we see them pivoting from Active Directory to cloud. We see them pivoting from the on-prem environment or cloud to other SaaS applications like a Salesforce. If they get access to Okta, for example, they will then access every single application that they can. They go after your internal code repositories. They will then, with all that access, will seek to create dummy accounts to maintain persistence, reactivate old accounts if they're still around, escalate privileges, do all the types of things that you typically see on the AD level, but they're doing it everywhere. And it's because it's not a single person, it's a team, a flexible team of people that have specific skills that they bring to bear depending on the technologies that they encounter in the environment. And so you'll constantly see them go through this cycle of getting access all across the board, which is what makes the incident response so critical, not just from a timely perspective, but being able to do it in an effective and efficient manner so that you can actually kick them out across the board and you don't have a hole lingering in your environment for them to come back in through, because they will do that 100%. So part of discovery is getting to know the lay of the land. Part of it is credential harvesting. And they'll do this in the traditional sense in the Windows environment. If you have users or IT perhaps that have LastPass exports or other types of Excel documents, we've all seen it. Unfortunately, it happens in an environment. If that's lingering or laying around, they will find it and they will leverage it. And you'll see that also happen on the different platforms they gain access to. So for example, I've seen them gain access to corporations' GitLab environment. And they'll integrate third-party applications like GitGuardian, for example, whose purpose is to scan your code base and identify secrets so that you can remediate it. Well, they'll use a legitimate tool like GitGuardian, create the integration to your GitLab environment, scan your code base for secrets, and then take those secrets and use it in the attack. So it's incredibly damaging. They do that not just for code, but they'll do that for Salesforce, for example, or other applications they get access to, where they'll use trials for legitimate third-party software to either exfiltrate data or do discovery on those applications and just get whatever is useful out of that platform, either exfiltrate it so they can use it for extortion, or take secrets or credentials to continue to use it throughout the attack. So it's not just, well, we'll do a global reset on Active Directory and we'll do the twice recycle of the golden Kerberos ticket. That's not sufficient because they have credentials all across the board. They have secrets all across your environment and your cloud. You really have to take a broader perspective. And so they've been doing that since 2022, but they continue to do that to this day. And we touched upon the impersonation that this group is fond of. So not only will they impersonate you, for example, if you're a BPO and they impersonate you to impact your downstream customers, but they will also impersonate your colleagues internally within the organization. They'll try, if they get a handle of, for example, a Zoom meeting invite that's related to the incident response, they'll join it. And they'll join it with the camera off and they'll see if they get away with it. With this group in particular, you have to have everyone show your camera, get on video camera, or meet all in the same room, because they'll sit in and listen and they'll react based on what your incident responders are recommending and make suggestions. And they'll call that out. As I said, they're very brazen now, unlike previous. So in 2023, slight difference to the overall attack chain. They use help desk primarily as a means to getting in. Again, really important to educate user awareness, not just for your users, but also for help desk, because they are now being socially engineered with greater regularity. And like we had talked about before, these types of trends start with a group, but then as other threat actors see the success that these trends are having, will start to emulate it. So they'll start with help desk, they'll gain access, they'll use residential proxies to try to blend into the overall environment and not make as much noise. They don't use as many RMMs now as they did previously. They typically prefer to use tunnels. So they'll create a VPN tunnel or use a reverse proxy on systems throughout the environment as a means of maintaining access and also exfiltration. But the discovery elements that they performed back in 2022, they're still performing today in 2023. They'll also, if they get access, for example, to your vCenter environment or any virtualization environment that you use, they will create virtual machines. If they have the appropriate permissions, they'll create their own virtual machines and they'll use that as their base of operations, knowing that none of your tooling is on that virtual machine. It's just a host in the environment. Of course, they'll try to name it in a way that's similar to your naming structure, but the main point is to hide their activities in the environment, and again speaks to sort of their creativity and flexibility in these types of incidents. One thing that's different and new in 2023 that wasn't in 2022 is they now have a relationship with Alfie/Black Hat. Most of you are probably aware that's a very popular, one of the more popular ransomware as a service groups, primarily caters towards Russians, but they have a relationship with Scattered Spider and Muddled Libra, and provide the ransomware encryptor and infrastructure to allow them to encrypt client environments, including ESXi, and then perpetuate and carry out the negotiation and cryptocurrency extortion. And so that's really their MO now. They're less focused on gaining cryptocurrency through BPOs and downstream supply chain attacks. They're now just focused on traditional exfiltration of data and extortion. But the way in which they go about it is very different and atypical from your typical threat actor. And I've bucketed these in, again, in the same three categories we discussed before: access, execution, objective. Just at a very high level, if you're looking at trends from 2022 to 2023, access has gone from smishing to socially engineering help desk. In terms of execution, they have a much cleaner and broader playbook than they did before. They no longer care about being silent. They want total dominance over Active Directory, SaaS applications, your cloud. Anywhere they can get access, they will seek access. And once they have that access, they'll plummet for whatever worth and value it has, either from a data perspective or ability to perpetuate and carry out the attack. Their objective, while has always been financially motivated, has shifted from downstream supply chain attacks and focused on cryptocurrency to data exfiltration and encryption, and targeting large singular or entities that can't suffer downtime. And so we talked about the attack chain. Let's talk about tradecraft. How do you defend against entities and groups such as this? And there's two primary categories you can consider. One is tactics and one is the tooling. Tactics are preferred when you're thinking about how to defend against these groups, because you can defend against specific tools, and you should defend against specific tools, but that's not sufficient because the threat actor can simply change their tools at any time. But if you're detecting or preventing the specific tactic that the tool is carrying out, that's much more preferred. And so I've broken it down into four different categories: credentials, applications, behavior, and network. And when we talk about credentials, we're really talking about a couple different strong indicators for this group, one being MFA bombing and SIM swapping. I mentioned SIM swapping earlier. They're very fond of using both MFA bombing techniques and SIM swapping when they aren't able to get help desk to reset the MFA factor for an account. They may be successful in getting them to provide the credential or reset the password, but help desk perhaps won't, in a stroke of good luck, won't reset MFA. In those circumstances, when they happen, they'll immediately attempt to do MFA bombs, trick the user into just accepting out of frustration, or SIM swapping. And one quick note on SIM swapping: if you receive reports of people having, all of a sudden their phones don't have cellular connectivity, that should raise some red alarms internally. But you should also check and look with your telcos to see if they support, for example, configuring a PIN before allowing such a change to be made. Some of them, like Verizon, do. So that should be considered as well as a preventative measure against SIM swapping. But you'll also see them, once they have access, re-enable accounts that haven't been active for a long time, create new accounts, start enrolling with great frequency a lot of different accounts with new MFA factors. And again, this is not a group that's trying to be silent. They are noisy, and they want as many accounts and access as they can, and they'll do that all across the board in all of your applications. So they don't care if you catch on to it, they just want to have as much access so that you trying to remediate it becomes a big challenge, and that's their hope. From an applications perspective, typically what you're seeing the group leverage is VPN technology to get in, but they'll also use other types of indicators that you need to be on the lookout for as well. So with respect to behaviors, one of the things to note is the persistent access. So you really want to pay attention to all your environment, not just Active Directory, but you need to take a look at the cloud environment. You need to be on the lookout for example, different accounts that haven't been active for a long time, suddenly having activity, perhaps at an inopportune time, perhaps from an unexpected location. Those behavioral indicators that typically are useful for threat actors continue to be useful for this as well, and something to keep a watch for. And from a network perspective, we talked about the RMMs and the ways that those are used, but also the proxies. So the VPN tunnels that are configured, or the reverse proxies. From a VPN perspective, as we go to the next slide here and talk about the tools, they will use a lot of your traditional VPN like Nord, private internet access, etc. But they'll also use different residential proxies that are listed on the slide too, and now they're using a little bit of both. And it's important that when you're thinking about the network and how to defend against this type of behavior, that you're blocking not only the tactics, but also the specific tools. And I know I prefaced that blocking the tactics is ideal, and it is, but the tools are directly actionable as well. So it shouldn't be one over the other, it should be both. And so when we talk about discovery, we'll see them using everything now from Mimikatz, which we see on many of our engagements, to legitimate tools like Advanced IP Scanner or AD Explorer, et cetera, tools that serve legitimate purposes but are often abused by threat actors, to malware like now Black Hat encryptors as what they'll use but also other malware that is now available to them through the relationship with Alfie and Black Hat. In addition to leveraging the playbooks and run plans that they get from that relationship. In terms of remote management, so we talked about how they were using RMMs. I had listed those previously, but there were things like TeamViewer, AnyDesk/Topatera, et cetera. Generally, they'll use any type of remote access tool that either has a free trial or is open source that they can leverage just for the purposes of the investigation. And that's a constant theme. If there's software that can help them carry out the attack that has a free trial, like GitGuardian, for example, for scanning your code base for secrets, they'll use that. We've also seen them spin up fake Okta tenants or Okta tenant trials, and they'll create a federation in your Okta tenant and theirs, and they'll leverage that access to be able to then not only have access to one specific account, but they'll impersonate 20 different accounts of all different permissions who have access to all different applications in your environment, and through that federation, be able to access those different applications for those accounts that they wouldn't have otherwise. And Okta actually released an article not long ago covering that specific attack vector. But you shouldn't lose sight of their purpose. So their purpose at the end of the day originally was impersonation to downstream victims, and now it also includes impersonating your administrators, whether that's internal Active Directory admins, IT admins, folks that work within different applications, et cetera. They will impersonate these users and interject themselves throughout your environment to continue to gain access, including during the incident response process and cloud. Data theft has always been a big MO for this group. They will not only look for exfiltration of sensitive data in the classical sense in terms of PII, but they'll also look for opportunities to take your trade secrets. And now that's being used primarily from a standpoint of prompting companies to be willing to pay as a result of extortion, and coupled with encryption, which they weren't doing previously, but now it has very much become part of their MO. And so let's talk about best practices. So new threats require new approaches. And when we think about this group in particular, I've broken it down into prevention, detection, and containment. And so it's great if we can detect, but ideally we prevent it ahead of time. And so I hope, based on what you've heard, you'll agree that awareness training is the #1 item that should be under consideration when we talk about prevention, because these attacks by this group and many others that are starting to emulate this group are all focused on the user. After all, you can patch all of your systems and you have processes for doing that. I think organizations understand the risk that comes with external facing systems, but people are notoriously hard to patch. You have to constantly work at it and remind them the real world impact, not only to organizations just over the world, but also your organization in particular, and what a cyber intrusion event means to the company. And I think one thing that is important to note is that when we talk about cyber intrusions, and just to put some context around it, 83% of organizations in 2022 had more than one reported data breach, and each data breach was associated with $4 million on average. And so hopefully that puts some numbers to it and some specifics for employees to get some perspective on why this is such an important topic. But it's not just the end users that need to be educated, it's also help desk. That's a critical component of this activity. And so we talked about detection. So detection, really we need to leverage machine learning and threat intelligence, AI. Threat actors are starting to leverage AI to effectuate and facilitate attacks with increasing frequency and complexity. Groups need to be able to do that as well, to be able to identify these types of attacks. And containment, lastly, we need to have AI, for example, like XOR from Palo Alto Networks product, or other security orchestration and automation tools, to be able to automate the mundane so that your cybersecurity teams can focus on what's truly important in defending your organization. Okay, lastly, people, process, and technology. I know we all hear it a lot, but it's incredibly important here. From a people perspective, awareness training, making sure that you go through tabletops, making sure that you have penetration testing specifically around social engineering, so that people can be prepared and know and have a sense of what's wrong and get those spidey senses, so to speak, to know when something's wrong and to be able to have an avenue to report and escalate up the chain. From a process perspective, leveraging AI, machine learning to automate the mundane shouldn't be something that replaces your people. We need talented cybersecurity professionals defending environments, but AI and machine learning should be a force multiplier for those individuals, so that we're not focused on dealing with the routine, but rather can focus on detection, containment, and process enhancement and improvement across the board. And then technology. A lot of different companies have a lot of great technology to sell. Unfortunately, a lot of those technologies don't work well together. So you really want to think about the technology that you currently have and where you're looking at down the road. Can you invest in a platform where these different technologies complement each other in a natural, organic way as they're intended to, and really, again, serve as a force multiplier for you in your incident response process? Lastly, don't panic, you're not alone. There are plenty of experts in the field that you can learn from. You don't have to go through these situations and learn them yourselves. You can engage external consultants, you can engage your colleagues who come from all parts of the industry and have their own perspective in an effort to be better armed and prepared for these types of attacks in the future. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you all.